So welcome to our pediatric webinar today. And as you know, our topic is speech audibility as a tool for pediatric audiology clinical decisions. And our guest speaker is Dr. Dave Gordey. Dave is the Director of Pediatric Audiology and Research for our headquarters in Denmark. And today he is based in his home in Toronto with snow. And I see we have a very international group. Thank you so much all for joining us. I did send a note last night, my time. If you want to turn on captions, you need to go to along the top bar to the word more and drop down to that, and it goes to language and speech. And from there you can choose show live captions, which will only show on your screen. And as I said, this is being recorded, so if any of your colleagues could not attend, we will post this back up on our YouTube channel on Monday, and I'll send a notice of that. Won't take too much time with introductions. I've known Dave for, I think, almost all of his 19 years with the company. He was involved with us way back with the Safari product development and launch, Sensei, and very much so with EduMic, Oticon Play PX. So Dave's been there all along with us, and we really appreciate all of his efforts and the research that he helps to guide and bring to us. So I'm going to let Dave, last thing I'll mention, if you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring that, and then we'll have time for Dave to answer all the questions at the end of the talk so that we don't have the interruptions. Okay? And for that, I will pass this over to Dave. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And nice to see you all here today. As Maureen said, we had a very snowy evening here in Toronto, Canada, where we had 25 centimeters or 10 inches of snow last night. So the city has come to a stop, but it's warm in this room, and I see a lot of warm faces. Many of you that I met at our pediatric seminar that we did at headquarters a few years ago. So I'm happy to be chatting with you today. I'm just going to share with you some slides, and then we'll go ahead and get started here. Okay, so today's topic is talking about speech audibility as a tool for pediatric audiology clinical decision making. And really, what we're trying to move away from or add to our clinical practice is that we are using the audiogram more so to document hearing levels, but we're not using it as a counseling tool. And that is because listening through headphones, through an audiometer, does not reflect real world. And so when we think about how we counsel and talk to families about the communication access their children may or may not have, the audiogram has limitations, but there is something that we can use that we feel is more impactful. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So why is it that we should talk about hearing loss in terms of speech audibility? Well, first of all, the audiogram is a tool for audiologists. And in research studies that I've completed, parents do not find it meaningful. Specifically, they tell us that it's difficult for them to relate degrees of hearing loss to communication access in real-world environments, or how they may be hearing different environmental sounds. So understanding speech is a term that parents relate to. They also relate to concepts like language development, learning to read, making friends, and communication. So what if we had a tool that we could use and it had free access to then convey to parents about how much access they had to speech and environmental sounds? Wouldn't that be great? So here's a quote from a parent that I did a research study with, and she said, When the audiologist showed me the audiogram, all I could think was, what does this paper have to do with our lives? Okay. So this is a good reminder that the audiogram is really for us as hearing care professionals who are working to document what we're doing. It really was never designed to be used as a counseling tool that could be meaningful for parents. So before we get into this speech audibility tool, we're going to use this case study throughout the entirety of today's presentation. And I don't want you to answer this question now, but more think about it. And I'll simply ask you the question. So on the screen, we have normal hearing to about 2000 hertz, and then it falls down to a minimal to mild hearing loss. And the question I'm asking you is, would you recommend a hearing aid for this patient based on this audiogram? Okay. And we're going to answer that question because you obviously need some more information, don't you? But think about this audiogram and what you may or may not do in terms of recommending a hearing aid. And then we'll come back to this case study a little later. So from the Canadian Academy of Audiology, they describe this degree of loss, 16 to 25 dB, as minimal hearing loss. And what they have documented is that these individuals may have difficulty with quiet or distant speech. And then as distance increases and noise increases, then some of the speech signal may no longer be accessible. They may be unaware of subtle conversation cues. They may tire in listening situations, especially where there is noise. There may be implications for learning language. They may require hearing aid amplification, and they may require special classroom amplification and instruction. Now, when we look at what the American Academy of Audiology is saying, very similar to the Canadian group, and they're saying that we know this group with minimal and mild loss may be at risk, and they may be considered candidates for amplification. Okay, so when I hear the word may be at risk, might be, that leaves us in a really tough position, doesn't it, in terms of decision making? Because what happens is that we have two options when we see, let's say, an infant. If we see an infant who is born with a minimal to mild hearing loss, we can do something called a failure-based candidacy, which means we don't provide a hearing aid and we wait and see to see if they don't develop speech and language in a good way. They start to have problems learning in school. We call that failure-based, and it's probably the least desirable type of intervention we want to provide. If we think of patients with unilateral hearing loss, this is another example of failure-based candidacy because, with that one ear that is functioning normally, sometimes we will wait and see how they do with their development and their learning before we intervene. And so the other thing that we can think about with this group of children with minimal to mild loss is that we may also wait until they're old enough to do sound booth testing so that we can understand what are their functional abilities, how do they make sense of sound in real world or simulated environments. Okay, so this is a tough group of patients, minimal and mild loss, because really that decision making can be very challenging. And so what we're going to talk about today is a tool that's going to help you frame this in, or help you understand this as through the lens of speech audibility. So we look at the research and we see many different studies, some saying that the impact of hearing loss, mild hearing loss in children, is impactful. We see the research on providing hearing aids or remote microphones is also mixed, meaning that some are recommending intervention, others are saying wait and see. And the challenge is that functionally, the impact of mild loss is invisible in those early years, those formative years, 0 to 3 years, when they're learning speech and language. We don't really know how this filter that the mild hearing loss is providing, how much of an impact this is having. And so when we think about older kids, this is a term that one of my colleagues in Philadelphia coined when she described children with minimal or mild loss. She said, it's like they are auditory squinting. Okay, so squinting is that term when we are not wearing our glasses, but we are trying to see what's on the screen and we make our eyes go like that to try and compensate. And what this audiologist believed was that for children with minimal and mild loss, they are likely auditory squinting. They are trying to work very, very hard to understand what is going on in the room, to make sense of that sound. And if you've forgotten your reading glasses and you squint for a long period of time, your eyes get tired. And the same thing can be said for trying to listen very, very hard with a minimal or mild loss, is if you're trying to fill in those blanks, understand what is being said, that can be very tiring. And eventually you may just simply give up trying to understand what is being said. So this is an interesting study. It is quite old. So, it's now, let's see, 30 years old. Wow. 1995 just seems like yesterday, doesn't it? But I like this study because it's very meaningful for us in how we think about a common test we use in the booth. So this is on the right side of the graph, we see word recognition scores in percent. And then on the left side of the graph, we see the pure tone average of 500, 1000, and 2000 hertz represented. And what Dubno did was they tried to understand what is the low level of speech understanding in quiet when you have different degrees of hearing loss as it relates to that pure tone average. And so we'll just jump down to when you have a pure tone average of 25, so that your hearing thresholds are on average 25 across the board, which in many places for children, people still consider normal. We see that their word discrimination score is 80%. And that's in a quiet environment with no room reverberation, no background noise, and no impact of distance. So if we think about as we move down that pure tone average, let's say even just to 30 or 35, which is still in that mild category, now we're getting down to only getting 68% of the words correct in that quiet, perfect environment. So just that's a good frame of reference, I think, for us when we think about the impact of these minimal and mild losses. So what we're going to talk about today is now I'm not telling you to throw away your audiogram or put it on your fireplace and burn it. I'm saying that for parents, we have a new tool that we can consider using that's going to be more informative and easier for them to understand. And that is called the Speech Intelligibility Index, and that's abbreviated as SII. So the Speech Intelligibility Index, this idea has been around for quite a while. We see the reference for this study was completed was 1990, so 30 years ago plus. But the Speech Intelligibility Index is an estimate of how audible the important frequencies of speech are. Okay. So when we think about the important frequencies of speech, we're thinking about 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 hertz. And that is where a lot of the speech sounds are found. That is where a lot of those consonant sounds exist that are important for speech understanding. Okay, so the idea would be to provide with the speech intelligibility index an estimate of how much speech is accessible to this person given their hearing levels when someone is talking at an average conversational level. Okay, so some researchers have evaluated the scoring of the SII. So the scoring of the SII, or the Speech Intelligibility Index, is scored on a range from 0 to 100. 100 meaning that 100% of that speech signal is available. Okay. And then as we move down, depending on how much hearing loss you have, when someone is speaking at an average conversational level, different amounts of speech are going to be available to you. Okay. So again, that speech intelligibility index, or that SII, it exists on a continuum from 0 to 100, and it represents the percentage of speech that is available to you given your hearing levels. Okay. So what Ryan McCreary wanted to know was, how much hearing do you have to get by with developing good language, vocabulary, and syntax? And so in this study, he had a group of normal hearing participants who had normal hearing levels, and they were going to complete this language test. And those children were from 3 to 10 years of age. And then he had another group of children who had varying degrees of hearing loss. And he wanted to know, based on their hearing that they had and their hearing loss, how much or what kind of a score on the Speech Intelligibility Index did you need to perform as good as your peers who had normal hearing? Okay, so the performance measure in this study was the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. So this is an assessment of language and vocabulary. And Dr. McCreary said, I'm going to have the normal hearing children complete this test, and we're going to see where their performance levels are. And then we're going to have the children with hearing loss, we're going to measure their speech intelligibility index, and we're going to connect that to their performance on this test. So we see that the dotted line on the screen is the, you could say, is the cutoff for where how much speech you needed to be available for you to perform normally on this test. Okay. The solid line was the lower end of that standard deviation. So we have an upper limit, we have a lower limit, which is the solid line, and then the average level is that dotted line. Now, we can see on the screen that that dotted line runs down to a number just about above 75, and essentially that number turns out to be 80. So what this means is that if you have hearing loss and you have a speech intelligibility index of 80 or greater, you're going to be able to perform in a similar way as children with normal hearing on this language test. Okay. Now, he went on to, oh, sorry about that, missed those animations there. He went on to use a couple of other language measures because he said, well, for that one language test, it was 80, but what if we did some other measures? Where would the speech intelligibility index fall? Or how much hearing did you have to have, or how much speech did you have to have available to you to perform in a way that was similar to the children with normal hearing on these language tests? And we can see, quite interesting, is that these both turned out to be in that range of 80 as well. Okay, so that you needed to have hearing levels where, if you had hearing levels where you produced a speech intelligibility index of 80 or better, you would perform well enough on these tests to have similar outcomes to those children with normal hearing. So we're going to use this guideline of a speech intelligibility of index of 80% or better means that in this moment in time, their hearing levels are good enough for them to develop language in a way that they're going to perform similar to their peers with normal hearing. Okay. So if you see, this has the possibility of using this as a guideline to help us understand when we decide to provide recommendation for a hearing aid or when we feel like it is okay to wait. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So is the audiogram enough to estimate the speech intelligibility index? Well, the downside of the audiogram is that we're listening through an audiometer. Okay, so we're listening through headphones. We're not taking into account distance, and we're not taking into account the size of their ear canal, right? So dial levels on the audiogram and thresholds that we get represent the measurements that we are recording through headphones. Those headphones are calibrated to a coupler, and those couplers don't represent little tiny ear canals of young children. So for a smaller ear, you're going to need a lower dial level on the audiometer to produce the same sound level at the tympanic membrane. And what this means is that when we have kids wearing earphones in the booth, the thresholds that we record may actually be underestimating what their actual hearing levels are. And this is why we also see that as children's ear canals get bigger, sometimes we see that their hearing thresholds appear to get worse on their audiogram. But actually, because their ear canal is now growing bigger, it's getting closer to that coupler that was used to calibrate the headphones. Okay, so the takeaway is that we need some way to understand how the children are actually hearing with their own ear canal versus what they're hearing with through the headphone. And we call that the real ear to coupler difference. And that's something that's also built into this tool we're going to talk about. Okay. So what we want to remember is that ear canal effects can vary by age and head circumference. And we see that variability to be highest in those early developmental years, which is unfortunate because this is where that precision of measuring the hearing levels is so critical when we have these little babies in front of us. Okay, so if we think of a baby who is 6 to 8 months old, their ear canal volume might be 0.6 cc versus a 10 or 11-year-old may have a ear canal volume of 1.2 cc's. And when you do your tympanometry, you often see that measurement when you make those recordings where you have your ear canal volume, and that's a good reminder of those differences. So we want to make sure that we are correcting the audiogram to make sure it actually is representative of what those smaller ear canals are hearing. Okay, so let's tell you about the tool. Here is the link to this free speech intelligibility index tool. There is a video that runs you through how to use it. So the video is actually just showing you, it doesn't use any language, but it's going to help you estimate the speech intelligibility index using your thresholds from your sound booth. Okay. It's going to allow you to use the RECD. Don't worry if you say, well, I don't have the equipment to measure the RECD. We have normative data entered here, and you can see there is a tab on the screen there to select the age of the child. And so we are then going to be using normative data. So the top figure is going to show you the thresholds that you measured in the sound booth. Those are represented in blue. And then the thresholds in red are going to show you the corrected thresholds based on their smaller ear canal volume. Isn't that cool? So this tool is doing a lot of work for you that's going to make this very easy for you to improve your hearing aid fittings. Then in the top right-hand corner, we have the RECD measures. And again, normative data for age categories have been included in this tool. And then this bottom figure is going to show you that percentage of speech that is available at 3 feet or 1 meter away. And it's going to, that is your speech intelligibility index. It's also showing you a range. So it's showing you the upper possible speech intelligibility or speech that is accessible, and then the lower end. And so just for an example, we're using that same hearing loss that I showed you, or pardon me, in this case, we're using a 30 dB hearing loss, and we see the differences here based on age. So on the right side, which is indicated by R, if you follow up, you'll see that the RECD selector is, let me just turn on my pointer here. We see here that the RECD selector is set to 3 months of age. And then on the left, it's 18 years of age. So look at the difference based on that ear canal volume. They both have the same hearing loss, but look how much more speech is available to that ear canal that is much bigger. So for this little 3-month-old, they only have 59%. And for that individual who's 18 and has a much larger ear canal, they have 75% available. So in both of these cases, we are below that cutoff of 80%. And so this would give us the indication that, yes, fitting a hearing aid would be a good idea. Okay. Okay. So just reviewing this a little bit closer is that when you do this calculation, you're given the overall speech intelligibility index as it relates to average conversational speech that is being heard at 1 meter or 3 feet away in a quiet environment. And then you are also given a confidence interval, which is showing the possible upper and lower range of that accessibility of speech. So with this tool, you can estimate speech audibility at different levels. So you have the opportunity to select whether or not you want to understand how much of speech is available at average, soft speech, or loud speech. And that's available to you by choosing different selections in the menu. So as I said earlier, and as we discussed that work from Dr. Ryan McCreary, he is telling us that we want to have a speech intelligibility index of 80% or better so that if we are not going to provide a hearing aid. Okay, if we're at 80% or better, theoretically, that is going to provide enough access to speech in a quiet environment for that development or performance on those language tests to occur. But what it doesn't tell us is it doesn't tell us the impact of noisy rooms, excessive distance. And so those might be additional conversations where when we're talking about learning in those different environments. So this tool is really talking about access to speech in a quiet environment. But I think, again, when we think about those children with those degrees of loss where we're really not sure of whether we should use a hearing aid or not, this tool is quite valuable. So again, the idea when we use this is that we can look at hearing thresholds in that minimal and mild range. And based on the age of the child, this is going to give us some talking points for families to say, instead of showing them an audiogram, which may, in their minds, and especially with the language of minimal mild, may reduce the potential impact when we talk about access to speech to say, well, given your child's hearing levels and their ears, who are 3 months old, your child in a quiet environment is going to have access to 66% of speech. And we can then reflect on the work from Ryan McCreary and say, we know from research that that number should be at least 80% for good speech and language development to occur. Okay. It's something that we can also track over time. So as a child ears grow, as their ear canal grows, for example, every time we make a new ear mold, we know their canal is growing. We can enter in their new age and we can watch and look at how their unaided speech intelligibility index is going to change. Okay. So it may be that with a minimal loss, we are providing intervention with a hearing aid in those early years. But then as they get older, we see that their speech intelligibility index actually improves as their ear canal grows. So it's a nice way to track those changes over time. Okay. So again, this is just another reviewing that example again of when we have identical hearing losses, but the ear canal sizes are different, we see how much speech is available to that listener. So for that 3-month-old, only 66% of speech is available. And for that 18-year-old, they have 78% available, given those hearing thresholds. Okay, so a nice way to talk about these hearing levels as a point of access to speech and normal conversational speech. So we could ask ourselves, does either need a hearing aid? Well, the 18-year-old is really right on the borderline, and their language, I guess we could review their language and look at what it's like as an adult. But certainly for the 3-month-old, we would probably consider using a hearing aid, at least through that critical period of language development to ensure they're getting all the input that is required. So that then brings us back to our very first slide. Would you recommend a hearing aid? And your answer would be, well, I need to now know their age, the size of the ear canal, and I want to measure or use the SII KIPA tool to know what their SII actually is. So I want to know how much speech is available to them before I can tell you if they need a hearing aid or not. Okay. So again, looking at this audiogram with a 7-month-old, let me just get my pointer on here. So we see that their speech intelligibility index for average speech, which is selected here, is 0.77. So they are below that 80 mark. For soft speech, they're at 61%. Okay. So in this case, yes, we would recommend a hearing aid. A 2-year-old, we see that for a 2-year-old, their SII is now at 86%. So that is above that 80 cutoff. And so we may not recommend a hearing aid. We may also want to closely monitor their speech and language development. But for now, we may feel that they are actually getting enough access to speech where a hearing aid is not warranted. And then with a 6-year-old, we see here their SII is 88%. So they're again above that criteria of 80. And again, we would just want to be monitoring how they're functioning in noisy classroom environments, how they function with their distance hearing. This might be a case where perhaps they're only using a remote microphone system, but don't require a hearing aid. So just to give you a quick overview of how you're going to use the KIPA tool, you will enter the hearing thresholds, okay? You will enter the age, and then, as I said, if you do not have equipment to measure the real ear to coupler difference, it will automatically be populated by the normed data. And then you simply hit the calculate button and your speech intelligibility index will be selected or will be displayed. And as I mentioned earlier, you have the opportunity to decide if you want to look at the speech intelligibility index for average speech. That is the default, or you can go ahead and adjust it to soft or loud speech. So before we wrap up and move to questions, some couple of interesting points just to bring up if you're using DSL. So I work at Western University part-time, which is where DSL was developed. And questions that frequently come up is, who is DSL child for and who is DSL adult for? So DSL child was developed for children with congenital or early onset hearing loss, and it's going to be used through their entire lifespan. So even when they are adults, you continue to use DSL child if they had an early onset hearing loss. DSL adult was developed for adults with acquired hearing loss. So if they previously had normal hearing, but through aging, they've developed hearing loss, this is where you would use DSL adult. Okay, so DSL child was based on performance and having hearing aids provide the best access to speech, whereas DSL adult was developed based on listening preferences and listening comfort. Okay, so that is the major distinction between those two fitting algorithms. Another question that comes up frequently is how close is close enough when I'm trying to meet my DSL target in the Genie software? Well, the more we can get that dotted line, that dotted red line, and the solid red line to lay over one another, so the better. So these are our targets for average conversational speech, which is the most important targets. Next important targets are MPO. We want to make sure that we are not going above that curve. But for mild to moderate severe hearing loss, the goal is that we are within about 3 dB of our DSL targets for that to be considered a good fit. Okay. Now, when you're using your Oticon hearing aids, we're really excited, especially with Play PX, that you're almost getting this really goodness to fit to target right away. So little adjustment is needed. Okay. We see from some other manufacturers, much more adjustments needed. We're happy that we can support clinical efficiency by getting you really close right from that first fit. Okay. So I'm going to leave it there and we'll open it up for some questions if you do have any. And thank you for your time today.
Dave, we have two questions.
Mhm.
First of all, well, three, one for me. But the first question, when you showed the graph showing is the hearing enough with the Ryan McCrary study with the red and blue lines, what were they because I know you listed normal hearing kids and hearing impaired kids. So the red and blue lines, what do they represent?
The red and blue lines were statistical cutoff points. So using different types of analysis, like a regression analysis. So they were essentially again showing that cutoff point of when your hearing levels were bad enough that you would not perform as good as the normal hearing kids on those language tests. So one was a regression analysis, and the other one is something called a piecewise analysis. So those are statistical ways to say, here is the cutoff where, if you have hearing above this level, you'll do just as good as the kids with normal hearing. If you have hearing levels that are below this cutoff point, then you're not going to perform as well on those language tests.
Okay, thank you. Rania also asks, the tool, of course, really interesting, but only reflects, as you mentioned, what happens in quiet, both for
Mhm.
soft speech, average, and for loud speech. So even if the SAI is good at, let's say, 86 in quiet, we know it will be different when noise and distance are involved. So is there any way to further counsel the family with that using the tool or not?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rania. I would say for me, I would think about that listening environment so that child is in. So if we have a 3-month-old who is presenting with a minimal hearing loss and they have an SII of, let's say, 86, I would say to the family, for now, in your controlled listening environments, um, I think we don't need to provide any intervention with a hearing aid because the baby is going to be held here, probably being looked after in a quiet environment, and that speech to ear distance is going to be very close. And then what I think of is as that child gets older and they might start going to preschool, and then that distance between the talker is going to increase, we could then measure the SII again with their bigger ear canal, see if it's changed. But then we're now talking about a listening environment that has noise, distance, um, reverberation, and we might say, to make sure we have the best communication access now that they're going to preschool, perhaps we want to do a hearing aid with a remote microphone system. So the way that again, we counsel in the moment. So where are you and your child and your life activities today? And then where are they going to change in the future? So I think the tool then provides that continuous conversation over time.
Okay. What about, I'm going to ask two questions. So in that same situation where now you have a child and going to preschool, we know it's noisy, lots of kids running around, music, all that stuff in the background. What do you feel about activating the noise reduction um, processing in those hearing aids that have it and making those kinds of recommendations?
Yeah, I think those have to be a case by case recommendation. We see that the early hearing infant protocols are nervous about activating advanced features for the 0 to 3 group. And that is because we don't have research on that young population. And of course, we don't have research on that young population because 2-year-olds aren't really good at telling you what they're hearing. So I think it comes down to you as an individual hearing care practitioner. So I have a colleague in the US who has fit a lot of Play PX on school age kids and says that I trust the way those features work. I understand how they work. I'm comfortable enabling them for younger children. So I think it's going to be up to you. If you feel more on the conservative side that, well, I would rather just leave everything turned off and use a remote microphone to support access in noise, that's okay. But if you have an experience where you say, I've been using Open Sound Navigator, I've been using More Sound Intelligence for years, I know these systems work, and I feel comfortable turning it on, then I think you'll do that. And that's what we see is that we don't make a general recommendation of what you should do.
Mm.
Um, we set it in the Genie software that for children 4 years and older, some of those advanced features are being turned on because that reflects those guidelines and protocols from infant hearing programs who say, well, the critical period of speech and language development is 0 to 3. We would rather not have advanced features on. But then as they get older, then you have that flexibility. They're also probably moving into more dynamic environments where you may want to turn those on.
Okay. And so the tool, I know we talked a lot about mild and minimal hearing loss, which is always difficult, as you said, that failure mentality. But what about a child with a sloping high frequency loss who maybe recently identified? So tell me about using the tool for those kids where you
Yeah,
have to, support your decision when parents say, well, they hear just fine, blah, 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 you know.
yeah. So I would say, we called it the mild hearing loss tool, but what we should have called it is the I don't know what to do tool. um, because really, anytime you have those hearing levels where you look at it and go, Man, this is a hard one. And you have a parent saying, "Well, I think they're hearing fine." This is where you can use any of those hard clinical decisions, put it into the tool, and look what their speech intelligibility index is, because it's going to give you that percentage that tells you how much speech is accessible in quiet. And then that's a really nice starting point as a conversation with a family to say, in a very perfect environment, which we know the real world is not, here's how much speech is accessible to them. Now, if we were to add noise, we would expect that to go down. And then you might say to the family, how important is it that your child is able to hear speech? Well, it's very important. I want to be able to hear the teacher talking in the classroom, their friends talking to them, you know. So I think that's how this tool is really nice. Whereas the audiogram, parents parents don't make the translation or they don't carry it over to what this means in the real world. And that's why I think the tool is so nice. So anytime you have a hearing loss where you look at it and say, gee, this is going to, I don't know what to do, if I should fit a hearing aid or not, use the tool.
Would you also agree that it's, as you said, as a counseling tool, to justify your recommendation? This is why we feel that this is a good recommendation for your child. We want to prevent all these issues. We also want to help with listening effort, things like that. I mean, I know it's not showing in the tool, but I mean, that's what I think of when I see a kid with a, maybe normal to 1, and then they start to drop off to just 60, 70, 80, or even, worse than that.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that I think you've addressed here that are important for all of the kids that you're seeing. So if you have a 6-month-old who has a moderate loss, who's recently been identified, so let's say their thresholds are 55 and 60, um, use the tool because you're going to correct the audiogram from the sound booth. You're going to have a record of it, so you can take a screenshot. Very soon, we are going to make a printable version of this of the tool, but you can do a Control Alt print screen, capture that corrected audiogram. But then when you talk to the parent, instead of using the audiogram, talk about the hearing loss and say, your child has a moderate loss. The amount of speech that is available to them without a hearing aid is 55%. So they're only getting half of that message. Okay. So I think that provides a really nice opportunity to counsel beyond the audiogram, no matter what the degree of loss is. Then as that child gets older, you take their audiogram from the sound booth, you put it back into the tool, it's going to correct it, and when you're going to actually get a better idea if those hearing thresholds are stable. Okay? Because one of the as I mentioned earlier, and I remember this as a clinical audiologist, a 9-month-old with a moderate hearing loss, then they come and I used headphones, they come back, and let's say they're now 2.5. The kid had a big growth spurt. Now I see the moderate hearing loss is decreasing. And I wondered, oh, is their hearing loss progressing? No, their ear canal is getting bigger and it's getting closer to the calibration level. So
Hmm.
that's how I see the tool could be used as a overall counseling tool for all degrees of hearing loss.
And that brings us to there's two questions. Do you recommend that this tool can also be used with adults? And do you see it anytime possibly being integrated into Genie?
It won't be integrated into Genie because of the normative data. So what's happening is that there are researchers out there who are continually refining those ear canal size measurements.
Hmm.
And by having this tool live on the KIPA website, and of course KIPA is a part of Oticon, we can make those adjustments easier. Whereas with Genie, we have to wait for a new release of Genie,
Oh
which
yeah.
sometimes can be a year and a half or 2 years. So with the tool living on the KIPA site, it allows us to make changes easier. And to your other question with adults, definitely you would be selecting, I think the upper level of the age selector is 18. So it could be a very good counseling tool for the amount of speeches that is available as well for those individuals, because um, having a conversation about with your hearing levels today in quiet as we sit 1 meter or 3 feet apart, here's how much speech is available to you. And again, because the audiogram doesn't justify or clearly communicate the impact. So I think
Mhm.
the tool could be a nice starting point for conversations as well.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? I think those are all very good. Here we have one. Does the tool have the ability to convert the thresholds obtained using evoked potential, such as with ABR?
Yeah,
Because ASSR does that on its own.
yeah, not yet. So the challenge that we have is that um, because we've talked about this, having a selector where you select ABR, but we would need to go across different systems, ABR systems, to see how those thresholds look and if they are comparable. So in other words, we wouldn't want to assume that if you're using a system from Interacoustics or you're using a biologic system, um, or a Hear Lab system, that those are all equal. We know that we can look at corrections and uncorrected. We're trying to work through that because it is something that comes up, but what you possibly could do now is just put in um, their corrected thresholds today. But um, yeah, it because I know it is being used. We have audiologists tell us when they're in the um, intensive care unit, the baby intensive care unit, they're doing the ABR and right away they're correcting those thresholds and putting them into the KIPA tool to decide whether or not they should start talking about a hearing aid to that family. So I know it is being used that way because it's just on your laptop. As long as you have internet access, you can get onto it.
Right away, sure. And the last question, also, if the tests are done with different transducers, insert versus um, normal
Head insert,
headphones,
yeah.
right?
So
Does that
this
allow that in the tool?
No. So right now it is only using inserts. It is only calibrated to or connected to using insert earphones, and that's because of the RECD data. Those norms have been collected on kids using insert earphones. So we don't, you can probably put in your headphones. I mean, it's going to give you a rough estimate, but it's not going to be as precise as if you're measuring using insert earphones.
Okay, so it'd be lower or higher in terms of the SAI number estimate.
I think it's going to, with the headphones, I think it's going to underestimate the SII.
Okay, okay, great.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you
But
very much, Dave. And as you mentioned, many people in different parts of the world don't have access to real air measurement equipment in their office, or even if they do, it's not always available. And some kids are really difficult, we know. So I think this is also a great tool to provide that SII that normally your real air measurement would provide for you, and give you, again, a very great counseling tool. Because like you said, parents are can much more relate to the audibility concept rather than just looking at the audiogram and then they say, oh, percentage of hearing loss, which we don't like to talk about that way. So appreciate the tool and that it's really developed. And as other people have noted, and on your handout, it's at kipagroup.org,
mhm.
and then under charts or also under resources, very easily available. And we'll watch for further developments with it.
Yeah, there's a lot of ideas. As I said, the thing that's top of mind right now is to make a printable version. That's what we're working on right now, is that you have the option to print to a PDF or just simply print that screen in front of you. And then there are some ideas of some other things that we'd like to do. So I think we should probably see some updates coming by this summer.
Great. Thank you, Dave. And I know you have other research you're working on that we're going to talk about having another session with you later this year
Yeah,
and share with all of our export customers. Thanks again, and thank you everyone for attending. And as I said, I'll do the recording and have it available for you on the our YouTube channel, the Oticon Export Training YouTube channel, and I'll also send a note out. I know some people who attended, I don't have their full email addresses, but I'll send it to everyone on the original mailing list, and then everyone can have access to it. Okay?
thank you. Bye for
Well,
now.
thank you. Thanks. Bye for now. Bye, everyone. Take care.